You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 43.
The large square blade gleamed in the firelight as it swept past in a downward arc, only inches from Maine's face. Having hit nothing but air, the blade continued down to Flattop's left. Maintaining his momentum, he spun around and swung the steel towards Maine at waist height. Reacting with lightning-fast speed, Maine bowed his body, getting his navel out of the way and narrowly avoiding the blade's leading edge slicing through his belly. The whole event probably lasted a fraction of a second, but for Maine it felt like it happened in super slow motion. He saw, with horrible clarity, his own reflection in the surface of the steel as it passed beneath his face, angling in to disembowel him. Any closer and it would have cleaved him in two, but instead it just sliced through his jacket, leaving the fabric hanging in pieces. Roaring with rage, Flattop followed up with a third sweep, which Maine ducked under before springing out of reach. Maine used the space to catch his breath, but he barely had time for one lungful. Flattop was on him again, swinging the makeshift blade with all of his tremendous might. Stepping and slicing, spinning and dicing, Maine bobbed and weaved, managing to stay just out of reach of the lethal steel. Flattop's frustration grew. He was yet to draw blood, but he had succeeded in slashing half a dozen cuts into Maine's jacket. Flattop swung the blade again and Maine saw his opportunity. As the steel flashed by, he stepped forward and landed several granite-fisted punches on Flattop's swollen eye. If he could close that eye completely, he would have the advantage. If he could close the other one as well, Flattop would be swinging blind, and the fight would be as good as over. But the anger boiling in Flattop's veins made him impervious to pain. Taking one hand off the steel, he struck Maine across the face with a tremendous backhander that put a constellation of stars in Maine's eyes and came close to breaking his jaw. Dazed, he stumbled and fell, landing on his back. Laughing maniacally, Flattop raised the steel high over his huge head and brought it down as hard as he could, aiming right at his brother's nose. Maine managed to roll aside at the last moment and felt the shower of sparks as the steel smashed against the tarmac right next to his head. Enraged that he'd missed, Flattop took careful aim and drove the steel down twice more. Maine rolled aside in the nick of time and narrowly avoided being cut in half. As Flattop raised the steel a third time, Maine scrambled to his feet and sprang out of the way. Several long silver locks of Maine's hair remained on the black tarmac, having been sliced off by Flattop's blade. Flattop glanced at the hair and grinned. "A few more mistakes like that from you and you'll end up with a haircut like mine," he scoffed. "Might change your perspective. Funny, I was thinking that a few more mistakes like that from you, and I'll have you right where I want you," Maine retorted. Flattop wiped some of the blood from his swollen eye. "You can't jump around forever, brother," he growled. "Pretty soon you'll put a foot wrong and I'll bury this in your skull." The same thing had occurred to Maine soon after the fight began. That was why he had carefully circled round and allowed Flattop to corner him against the truck. Now the truck was only a few meters behind him. Flattop eyed his brother, then charged forward swinging. The first blow was aimed low, clearly intended to cut off Maine's legs at the knees. He jumped it, and when his boots hit the ground he stepped back until he was less than 1 meter from the truck. Sensing that his opponent was trapped, Flattop gripped the steel tightly and swung at Maine's head with all of his might. Maine ducked, felt the rush of air as the blade flashed by, and then he heard a terrific smash as the blade struck the section of the roof remaining in the truck and sank in. The grin on Flattop's face disappeared. He pulled on the steel, but he couldn't dislodge it. It was stuck fast in the roof of the truck. Maine didn't give him a chance to try again. Seizing Flattop in a bear hug, he lifted the giant GX off the ground and hurled him against the flatbed tray on the back of the truck. As the truck was lying on its side, the rusty flatbed was a vertical surface, and Flattop's head hit it like a club striking an iron gong. The truck rocked from side to side and the sonorous thrum reverberated in the night. Flattop collapsed on the ground and gasped for breath, winded by the force of the hit. Maine looked at his brother and hesitated, unwilling to make the killing stroke. Flattop looked beaten. Maine leaned over, exhausted, his hands braced on his thighs. "Give it up," he said. "There's nothing more to fight for. Abby and Isabelle are back with the yetis. They're all probably long gone from the airport by now. The mission is over. Killing me won't make any difference." Flattop nodded tiredly, his black eyes half closed. Maine relaxed and started to sit down. It was the moment Flattop was waiting for. His expression changed from tired to tyrannical, and he leapt straight at Maine, his huge hands reaching forward for a strangulating grip. Maine was caught off balance and barely had time to raise one arm in defense. Flat Top struck him in full flight like a battering ram. He knocked him to the ground and wrapped his hands around Maine's neck, cutting off his windpipe. As Maine began to choke, Flat Top's black eyes glittered. "At least I'll be able to tell the Grand Marshal that I killed a traitor," he roared. Maine clutched at Flat Top's muscular arms and managed to gasp out a few words. "I found out." What the Grand Marshal meant when he said, "Liquidate the GXs," Flat Top's murderous expression changed like a shifting of shadows across his face. He remembered very clearly the moment when the Grand Marshal said those words. "Once we have created a few successful batches of Yeti Cross test subjects, we can liquidate the GXs and direct all of our resources to creating the next generation of super soldier." He shook his head like he was clearing a bad dream from his mind. "It doesn't matter anymore," he snarled. "It matters," gasped Maine, "because it means our masters intended to kill us." After we completed the mission, Flat Top's face seemed to twist in on itself, then twitch uncontrollably. A look of desperation filled his eyes. "You're lying," he howled. "They've got no reason to do that." "Why would they do that?" "Because we are an experiment," gasped Maine. "We're half gorilla and half human. The North Korean military scientists made us." "That's impossible," howled Flat Top. Maine tried to shake his head but only succeeded in twitching. "I know because the Yetis ran tests on us when we arrived in Shangri-La. They told me after you'd gone," he explained. Flat Top's grip around Maine's neck began to loosen. "If our masters get a Yeti or a Yeti tooth," Maine continued, "they'll use it to make the next version of us. The next generation of super soldier. When that happens, we'll become surplus to requirements. That doesn't mean they'll put us out to pasture. It means they'll put us in the ground, 6 feet under. We'll be killed and our bodies gotten rid of, disposed of, or more likely, cut up into little pieces and stuffed in jars filled with formaldehyde. Eyeballs in one jar, pinky toes in another. That was what was going to happen to us. That was going to be our reward for completing our first mission." Flat Top suddenly let go of Maine's neck like his hands had been electrocuted. He sat back, an expression of profound disbelief on his face, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of North Korea's betrayal. Maine rolled over and levered himself into a sitting position, sucking in lungfuls of air like a drowning swimmer who had just made it back to the surface. His neck, which was as thick as a thoroughbred stallion's, had purple welts that perfectly matched the shape of Flat Top's hands. On the far side of the runway, Shawkat, Vander, Grint, Simbara and Zana were running in a southerly direction that would take them to a place in the field where they could rendezvous with Hassan and his team, who were coming from inside the airport terminal. After that, they would find the claws and be on their way to the safety of the Himalayas in a comfortably short period of time. There would be reports to write and explanations to give, Shawkat knew. The airport terminal had become a scene of terrible death and destruction, just as the Shangri-La Council had feared. A lot of innocent people had been murdered, people who came from all over the world. This was a disaster that touched many nations, including the economically and militarily powerful ones. It would be world news by the time the sun came up over the mountains. The North Korean military were squarely to blame for the whole bloody affair. The assault force was ruthless and had killed in cold blood over and over and over. The Yetis were blameless for their part in the events, but they still had some soul-searching to do. Legally speaking, their actions were justified, given that they were properly protecting their fellow citizen and her human guest from abduction, torture, and death at the hands of the North Korean military machine. But when considered from a different perspective, the Yetis did bear some responsibility for what had happened. After all, the whole tragedy was fundamentally about protecting Shangri-La and the Yeti secret. The fact of the matter was that if the GXs had never found out about Shangri-La, the North Korean assault team would never have come to Tribhuvan. The massacre would never have occurred, and all of those people waiting at the airport would have boarded their planes, returned to their homes, and gotten on with their lives. Instead, they had all died in a blaze of North Korean gunfire. Shawkat's team had done the right thing, protecting the people in the airport as best they could in accordance with the Shangri-La Council's order not to bring projectile weapons. Admittedly, Hassan had used a rocket-propelled grenade launcher to turn the North Korean plane into a flaming wreck, but nobody knew that except the other members of the Yeti rescue team, and they would keep their mouths shut about it. In any event, the fireball on the tarmac could have been caused by any number of factors. The plane was probably loaded with ammunition, and the soldiers were refueling it when it exploded. Shawkat would be sure to note those two facts in his report. When he and his team arrived at the rendezvous point between the airport terminal and the claws, they stopped and waited for the others to join them. They shouldn't be too far away, remarked Grint. Shawkat agreed. Activating his button mic, he asked for an update on their position. Hassan was standing at the window from which he had earlier deftly removed the glass using one sharp claw in the VIP lounge of the airport terminal. He and Pemba were the last ones still in the building. The rest had already gotten down to the ground by either jumping or climbing down a drain pipe. They were all standing on the muddy ground below, looking up, waiting for him to jump out of the window, followed by Pemba. The problem was there was no sign of Sierra, and he still wasn't answering his radio. Hassan thought about it and realized he hadn't heard from or seen his Yeti companion for over 10 minutes. Very worried now, Hassan ran back to the door leading to the VIP lounge and stared into the hallway, hoping against hope to see his friend emerge from the shadows with a rueful grin on his face and a tale to later tell about why he had taken so long to rejoin the group. The seconds ticked by and Hassan stared hard, but nothing was moving out there. A sickening feeling of dread settled into the big Yeti's stomach. His earpiece crackled with Shawkat's query. Reluctantly, Hassan pressed his button mic and explained that Sierra was missing, last seen some time ago during the pandemonium that erupted when Flattop's truck plowed through the building. He was MIA, missing in action. There was a long moment of silence in his earpiece as everybody listening into the conversation contemplated the consequences of this information. They had saved Abby and Isabelle, only to lose Sierra in the final stages of the mission. Hassan spoke into his button mic. "Pemba, can you climb down to the ground without me?" he asked. Pemba peered out the window. The drain pipe that the others had used was just within reach. "Yeah, I think so," he replied. "But I don't know if I should leave without you." "Don't worry about that," Hassan said. "Climb down, then head back to the claws with the others. I'll be along as soon as I can." The Nepalese teenager reluctantly acknowledged the instruction. One missing Yeti was bad enough, but two would be even worse. If Hassan went missing as well, someone would have to go back to find him as well as Sierra. At this point in time, that was the last thing they all needed. Nevertheless, Hassan had given him an order, so he had to follow it. Wiping his sweaty palms along his trousers, he leaned out of the window as far as he could and took a firm grip on the drain pipe. Up close, he saw that it was a lot rustier than he'd thought it was, far too likely to come loose and send him plummeting to the ground, causing serious injuries. The quicker he was off the thing, the better. He shimmied down as fast as he could and planted his boots safely on the muddy ground. He joined the others, who were all looking up at the dark window. "Hassan's gone back," stuttered Gulbenkian. Pemba nodded. "To look for Sierra," he explained. "He wants us to meet up with the others." Abby felt a pang of guilt. The people who had come to rescue her were starting to disappear one by one. "I don't think we should leave him," she protested. "Me neither," Pemba said, "but that's what he said to do." They all turned and started across the field. Mohawk and Zaw kept them moving at a good pace. Abby kept looking over her shoulder, waiting to see the two Yetis appear at the window. Soon the group was making its way through the middle of the dark field, and the building behind them was dwarfed by the black emptiness of the airport grounds and the sparkling constellations overhead. Shawkat and the others were less than 100 meters away. Abby looked back again, hopeful. Now the window was a small rectangle in the distance about the size of her pinky claw. With her sharp eyesight, she saw it clearly. But there was no sign of the two Yetis. Hassan left the VIP lounge and moved quickly along the corridor on the first floor. When he came to the escalator leading down, he paused for just a second and listened. As far as he could tell, nothing in the area was moving. It looked like the North Koreans had cleared out. Not surprising. Their mission was a failure and they were getting out while the going was good. There were probably no soldiers left in the building, other than the sleeping ones. Were Hassan being more cautious, he would have taken longer to establish that the area was clear. But now, time was of the essence. The airport building was silent, but outside, countless sirens were wailing. He wasn't sure if they were police or ambulance sirens, but it didn't really matter. The government authorities were on their way, and that meant the Yeti team needed to disappear as fast as possible. Once the airport was filled with police, one of them might manage to snap a photo of the claws as they were taking off. Hassan had no desire to see his own smiling face on the front page of a Nepalese daily newspaper. He needed to find Sierra and get him out of here, preferably alive, but in a body bag if necessary. That was an unpleasant thought, and he pushed it from his mind. Racing down the escalator, he stopped at the bottom and glanced around. The turmoil on the ground floor was as he remembered it. The bodies, grotesque in violent death, were lying where he remembered them. Then he noticed a thick red stain across the floor. It led from one side of the room to the shattered windows, then out onto the tarmac. A blood trail, no doubt, unremarkable in this house of horrors. There was a lot of blood on the ground, and that trail was not unique, not something that would attract a pathologist's attention. But his sharp eyes discerned that its color was subtly different to the other blood in the area. Hassan's pulse quickened. Hurrying over, he crouched down and looked closer. Yes, the color was definitely different. He touched it with the tip of one finger and sniffed it. Yeti blood. He forced himself to search the area for Sierra's body or parts of it. He quickly found a piece of bone and, as far as he could tell, skull. Outwardly, Hassan hardly moved. Crouching there, wearing his hooded black toga, he looked like the Grim Reaper praying beside a pool of blood. Ironically, the exact opposite was true. Hassan was a force for good whose lifelong purpose was to save lives, both human and Yeti. Sierra had been the same, and now he was dead, killed doing what was right, doing what he believed in. A wave of sadness swept over Hassan. He lowered his head, squeezed his eyes shut, and remained that way for a long moment, trying to control the strong emotions that welled up inside him. Then he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and focused on what had to be done next. Using the evidence before him, he started to piece together the story. It was clear that Sierra had been shot in the head and killed immediately. From what range the shot had happened, Hassan wasn't sure. Whatever the answer, his body had been dragged across the floor and then outside. The blood trail continued some distance onto the tarmac, past the flaming plane wreck, and then suddenly stopped, right where the other plane had been parked. The plane the North Koreans had commandeered after Hassan blew up their first one. That was not the conclusion Hassan was looking for. He thought it through, trying to work out if he'd misinterpreted the evidence. But after a minute or so, he was forced to admit that the evidence all pointed to one answer, and one answer alone. Sierra's body was on the North Korean plane. Hassan activated his button mic on an open channel mode so everybody could hear the communication. "Sierra's dead," he said grimly. There was a long moment before anybody responded. Several hundred meters away, in the dark field, Shawkat rubbed his furry hand over his face as he came to terms with the terrible news. Vander, Simbara, Grint, and Zana looked equally shocked. "Understood," Shawkat replied, speaking into his button mic. "Bring his body back. We can't leave it there to be discovered." He didn't mention that somebody was going to have the grisly task of flying back to Shangri-La carrying Sierra's body in a tandem harness. "I can't," Hassan said. "It's been taken by the North Koreans." Shawkat exchanged an alarmed glance with Simbara. "You mean his body's not there?" he asked. "No," Hassan replied. "So how do you know he's dead?" asked Simbara. "He might be injured and hiding somewhere." Hassan explained what he had found on the floor and the blood trail leading out to the tarmac. Shawkat listened to Hassan's story and became increasingly concerned. He started to walk back towards the airport. In the distance, he saw a plane moving slowly on the far side of the runway, over 1 kilometer from where he was standing. The plane looked like it was taxiing into position in preparation for takeoff. "Hassan, I can see a plane moving on the runway," Shawkat said. "Is that the plane that the North Koreans grabbed after you blew up theirs?" Hassan could see the plane more clearly from his vantage point in the airport terminal. "Yes," he answered. In the field, Zana stood beside Shawkat. "We've got to get Sierra back," she exclaimed. "I know that," thundered Shawkat. If they didn't get Sierra's body back, it would be the first time in modern history that incontrovertible evidence of the Yeti's existence had fallen into unfriendly human hands. Shawkat had only seconds to make a decision about what to do, and it appeared that he had no options. "Hassan, how far are you from that plane?" asked Shawkat. "Too far to catch it," Hassan replied. Shawkat swore and said, "Who else is in the vicinity? Maine. Where are you right now? Maine, are you listening?" There was no answer. "God damn it, Maine, we need you now," Shawkat roared. "Where are you?" Still no answer. Isabelle, who was walking through the field with Mohawk and the others, heard Shawkat's query in her earpiece and the silence that followed it. When Maine didn't answer, her eyes filled with tears. A look of great sadness crossed Mohawk's face. "Maine must have been taken out by Flat Top," he said into his mic. A crackle from the earpiece followed by, "Understood." Isabelle looked up at the silver-haired giant. "He shouldn't have gone after Flat Top," she screamed. "He didn't need to. Abby and I had already been saved." Mohawk put his arm around the blonde girl's slim shoulders. "He knew what he was doing and he made his choices," he said. She shook her head. "I don't understand why he couldn't just let Flat Top go," she muttered. Mohawk nodded. He understood, but it wasn't something that he could explain. In the field, Grint was gesturing excitedly, trying to make his point. "It's not over yet," he declared confidently. "I reckon I can take out the plane with a claw." Shawkat frowned and asked, "How?" "Some kind of collision, kamikaze style," Grint explained. I'm not exactly sure. I'll work it out when I'm in the air. Are you serious? Cried Zana. Forget it, there must be a better idea. It wouldn't work anyway, said Simbara, because a claw can't keep up with a commercial aircraft. So you'd never get near it. Grint threw up his hands in exasperation. Well, we'd better think of something, because if we don't get Sierra's body back now, we'll never get another chance, he snapped. Unless you're planning an expedition to North Korea. Shawkat was pacing back and forth, hands on hips. I'm thinking, he muttered. Maine stumbled over and picked up the earpiece. He didn't realize it had fallen out of his ear until he saw it lying on the ground. When he put it in, he immediately heard the babble of voices and caught the tail end of the conversation about Sierra's body being on the North Korean plane. Maine stood up, a look of despair on his face. The plane was some distance away. Oh no, he breathed. Flattop watched his brother. You're in contact with the yetis, he grunted. Maine nodded. One of the rescue team has been killed, he said. His body is on the plane. The North Koreans have got what they wanted after all. Flattop stood up and looked at the plane. Then he looked at his brother, then back at the plane. Right now, his life was at a crossroads and he was clearly choosing which way to go. The high road or the low road. Maine had explained which was which, but only Flattop could make the final decision. Maine would dearly have loved to know what he was thinking, but Flattop had a blank expression on his face that was impossible to read. It was like the paralysis that affected Flattop's conscience had now spread to his entire face. That didn't bode well. Flattop had released his grip on Maine, but that didn't mean North Korea had released its grip on Flattop. After everything that had happened, it was still possible that the genetically engineered commando codenamed GX-3 was still loyal to the regime that created him. Flattop fixed his unblinking gaze on Maine once more and made up his mind. With renewed energy, he slammed his enormous hands against the flatbed tray and pushed with all of his strength. The iron groaned, and then the truck slowly toppled over and fell back onto its wheels, where it shuddered violently on rusty suspension. Shards of glass and discolored steel rained down on the tarmac. The windows were broken, the panels were bent, and the roof was torn off, but aside from the cosmetic damage, the truck was still in drivable condition. Flattop tore the broken door off its hinges and got into the driver's side. Maine made no attempt to stop him. Enough had been said and done. Take care of yourself, brother, he said with a heavy heart. Flattop turned the ignition and the old truck rumbled to life. There was a grinding of gears as Flattop prepared to go. He looked at Maine sadly. His parting words rocked Maine back on his heels. I can't change what I've done, but I can make it right, Flattop said. Say goodbye to Mohawk for me. Tell him I'm sorry about everything, for Abby and Isabelle. Flattop paused and glanced away, struggling for words. And tell him I always liked his hair the best, Maine frowned. I will, he murmured. Before Maine could say anything else, Flattop floored the accelerator and the truck roared away, heading in the direction of the North Korean plane that was at the other end of the runway. Shawkat and the other yetis saw the truck race down the runway towards the plane in the distance. Grint clapped his hands together enthusiastically. That must be Maine, he's gonna ram the plane, he exclaimed. Can't be, said Zana, because Maine's dead, remember. Maine heard the conversation in his earpiece and answered, Actually, I'm not dead and it's not me in the truck. He paused, then added, It's Flattop. Grint's excited tone turned angry. What, you let him get away, he roared. He knows the location of Shangri-La. A yeti would have thrown himself under the wheels of the truck and sunk his teeth into the tires before letting Flattop get away. Maine sighed tiredly. Yeah, well, I'm not a yeti, he replied. So Flattop got away and now we'll have to wait and see what happens next. What do you think is gonna happen next? Grint howled. The plane's gonna fly back to North Korea and we're never gonna see it again. That's what's gonna happen next, you moron. Maybe, Maine said, his voice trailing off. Zana, who was more attuned to the subtleties of human expression, asked, What do you mean, Maine? I think Flattop finally understands, Maine replied. Understands what? Asked Zana. That he's been fighting for the wrong side, Maine declared.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.